If you've traveled around China, almost any part of China, but especially Taiwan, you will have seen a lot of things named Datong. You will have seen road signs, you will have seen universities named Datong, you will have seen monuments with Datong and things like it written on them. What's the big idea? Well, the Datong Shu is one of the most influential books in the history of modern China, and the idea of Datong does go back to Confucius. Pretty much all sources will agree that Kang Youwei is famous and is important for history, but they'll disagree as to why he's famous or what he's famous for. In an earlier period of his life, what really brought him to national and international acclaim was a period in Chinese history called the 100 Days of Reform. During these 100 days, he was at the pinnacle of international influence, fame, and, frankly, notoriety. The 100 Days of Reform ended in failure, which means that the social reforms he was proposing at the time never had a chance to play out for better or for worse. So in some ways, as he entered into a long period of exile, he was a symbol for the promise that China could have had, would have had, or should have had, if only things hadn't fallen apart quite so disastrously at the end of the imperial period. In terms of what Kang Youwei actually proposed the Chinese government should do to adapt to the modern world during this earlier time, 1898, many people remember him either as a sort of moderate reformer, as some kind of Confucian conservative, which is misleading, as we'll get into, or at least associate him with a kind of pragmatic, westernizing tendency in China at the time. You could say that he was trying to preserve the monarchy in China, but to move towards something that much more resembled modern England, a constitutional monarchy with some small role for the emperor, but elected officials and all the advantages of a Western, technologized, democratized society. As you can imagine, given the extreme violence of what happened both earlier and later in China's political history, this generally means that Kang Youwei is remembered as one of the good guys. However, his own philosophy is much more radical, much more subversive than people tend to want to admit in retrospect. That's why it's a bit strange that still today some sources report that he was a conservative Confucian, when his own ideas included the total abolition of the family, the abolition even of family names, and of basically everyone being reduced to being an orphan raised in government orphanages from birth, never knowing or meeting their parents. If you know even a little bit about Confucianism, you'll realize that that's radically anti-Confucian, and, well, it's impossible to associate him with either conservative Confucianism or conservative Buddhism at the time. His most influential work, which is why there are so many street signs called Datong, was called the Datong Shu. I guess you could translate that as the Book of the Great Unity. Some others call it the Book of the Great Harmony, something like that. The idea of Datong does appear in Confucius. However, it's just a vaguely alluded to future utopia of some kind. It isn't really an idea or philosophy that's worked out in detail in Confucius, although the phrase itself does go back to that period of earlier antiquity. One of the main reasons why the study of Kang Youwei's intellectual legacy is so important today was that he directly and deeply influenced Mao Zedong. That's despite the fact that, as I've already mentioned, he wasn't a communist. He actually openly rejected communism in his own writing, and as I've described, he was mostly remembered for very moderate, pro-democratic reforms. However, there's a big gap between that period of early fame and when his actual utopian vision of the future, the Datong Shu, was finally published in 1935, actually years after the author's own death. You'll find a lot of misleading information about this, because I guess you could say the prologue to the book, just the first 2 chapters, was published at a much earlier date. However, those first 2 chapters are a kind of pseudo-Buddhist set of reflections on the suffering and corruption and evil of the world, setting out the case as to why a future utopia is necessary, or how Chinese society can and should be bettered. You don't really get a hint as to how radical Kang Youwei's ideas really were, or how far he's going to take it. What were the ideas that Kang Youwei wrote about that so appealed to Mao Zedong, or so strongly influenced him? Well, you have to remember, communism was originally a European philosophy, And even though many intellectuals, including Mao himself, tried to adapt communism to be more appealing to and more relevant to an Asian reading audience, works like Kang Youwei's Datong had the advantages of really being written in an idiom that would appeal to a Chinese intellectual. Of course, that includes the selective use he made of Confucian and Buddhist sources, everything about his verbiage, but also his interpretation and reinterpretation of what was then going on in Western science. He has a lot to say about Darwin and social Darwinism, for example. However, to be more specific and concrete, I could say that you really see in Kang Youwei very particular ideas about how social change was going to be brought about how, for instance, villages would be reorganized into communes, how agriculture would be transformed in rural China, and most directly, how industry and the distribution of goods would change when the private sector was destroyed and replaced with an expanded public sector. In reading those parts of the text, we seem to have the very clear outlines of what Mao Zedong attempted to do, especially during the Great Leap Forward period of China's history. I'll provide a link in the description to this video so that you can read my relatively long and boring essay that fills in a lot of the details on this. But, very briefly, I should also mention how Kang Youwei's philosophy is very different from that of Mao Zedong. Well, there are several aspects of his thought that were obviously either appealing to Mao, taught him ideas that were influential, or confirmed ideas that Mao already had. We can also see that Mao chose to ignore a large part of what Kang Youwei's philosophy was all about. Among other things, Kang Youwei completely assumed that the future for China would start with emulating Western democracy, involving elections, parliaments, ballot boxes, voting to decide almost every major issue in society, including the prices of goods, educational reforms, things like that. Obviously, China would be a very different place today if Mao had responded to that aspect of what Kang Youwei's philosophy had to offer. Although it would be misleading to describe him as either a Buddhist or a Confucian, it's true that his future utopia does include both of these religions in some capacity, and that, for example, he takes a lot of interest in the suffering of animals and promotes veganism, saying that in the future, human beings simply will not eat meat at all, and that all exploitation of animals will be discarded as a thing of the past. Now you have to consider, Mao had many possible sources of influence to choose from. However, the type of grandiose verbiage that Kang Youwei offered to Mao or to any Chinese reader of the time was probably a lot more inspiring than detailed, boring reports from the USSR about Soviet attempts to bring about collectivization and economic change, whether at the village level, at factories, or otherwise. Remember, by 1949, the Soviet Union already had decades of experience with, failed experiments in social change that China could have learned from. But that stuff would be pretty dreary to go through. And by the 1960s and 1970s, it's pretty clear that China wanted a refreshing break from their own past, including their very recent communist past. And that's when they took on the much more radical and frankly disastrous movements of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. You can watch some of my earlier videos, by the way, discussing what happened and how many people died and the new English language literature talking about it. In short, it's a shame that so little is written about Kang Youwei and so little is understood in English. He really was one of the most influential Chinese authors of the 20th century, both in terms of the influence he had on hardcore communists and, paradoxically, because of the direct influence he had on anti-communists, not least of all in Taiwan.